session of Irish History from the Hedgerow at the Irish Roots Cafe, produced by IrishRoots.com with Peter Riley Adams and Michael O'Laughlin. Find a spot on the warm, sunny side of the hedgerow now. Today's session is about to begin. They were rough, unpolished men, brilliant scholars, teaching by the side of the road, in small rooms, in nooks and crannies, wherever and whenever possible. Such men as these, they were the teachers of the hedge. Class is about to begin. Everyone to their places. We're now dealing with the history of education in Ireland, and we're leading up to the rise of the Hedge School and just what that meant in Ireland. And that's very important to us here at the modern-day Hedge School. So we thought we'd go back a little bit in time to see what led up to the foundations and some of the customs that the Irish had at the time of the Hedge Schools beginning in the 17th century. We'll go back to, well, even just a little bit before St. Patrick and see how all this worked together. Now, I should also mention when we talk about Hedge Schools, I've got a vested interest. My great-grandfather was educated in a Hedge School in County Kerry, and that would have been Michael Donahue. Peter, I understand that you have some family connection to the Hedges or to education in Ireland, too.
Well, my grandfather, on my mother's side, my mother's father, was a teacher in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, in Fermanagh. And I can't actually find out exactly where he went and that because of records and what people tell and don't tell in stories. But he was a very well-educated man. I have still many of his books. And he was educated in a fine classical tradition, and he knew the right subjects.
Well, let's now go and see just how all this came about in Ireland and why it happened and how much has been romanticized and how much was true. Let's start out. We'll take a look at the ancient Bardic schools, and that, of course, those are the things that we know the least of, at least their early foundations. But you could say that they existed before the coming of St. Patrick and formal Christianity to Ireland. And if we take a look we got to go back to the earliest writings that we can find. And in an early 7th century memoir of St. Patrick, they talk about there being a contest between St. Patrick and the Druids. And each was to take a book and throw the book into the water and see which one came out uninjured. Now, that very same story is told in the Tripartite Lives of St. Patrick. So being back so close to that time, that tells us that the Irish were definitely familiar with writing and letters. And, Kerry's very famous for the Hedge schools, or at least a lot of it's come down to us. And the earliest written language is found over there in Kerry around the ancient tribal lands of O'Falvey and O'Shea. So we're making connections with something there. Now, you also might ask, well, could they even write then? Were they just an oral society? Well, if they had a book, that would make you say at least there was at least some class that could write and understand it. And tradition also tells us that the Irish used Ogham, and you can see the pillar stones there by the chiefs' graves with their names carved in stone. And later on, some of those stones were used. They carved the English alphabet into those stones, and maybe even the Irish alphabet, to teach students to memorize it by looking at it. And that has come down to us.
And they also, in Ireland, I've been in Kerry, I've seen a lot of the Ogham stones. And they found them as they were doing construction of various things in the roads. And so then, because they realized the importance, they're lovely, huge pieces of rock, and they put them up and they make and then they show, here's the writings, which are lines and crosses. But as Christianity came in, they also added to those stones and put Christian symbols. And you can see some of the old Gaelic circles and that from the older period. But they would almost make pictures on the stones. It's like the Celtic crosses. And so there's lessons being taught even on the stone. Some of those Ogham stones, they don't know what the alphabet is. They're still trying to figure out actually what it all says.
Well, that's right. They've done a lot of work on that. And, both the Bardic Literature and the Lives of St. Patrick talk of finding, upon arriving in Ireland, they found literary and professional men, and they were all pagan, of course, Druids and poets and antiquarians, and an elaborate code of laws that the people went by. And of course, that a code of laws, if it's that elaborate, usually requires some kind of writing to formalize it. So immediately after the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century with Patrick, they began writing it all down in the Irish language, which tells us that they probably understood letters already, but, we're still speculating, at least in the things that I've read of
Well,
late.
we also have the writings of St. Patrick.
That's right.
So, he wrote his confessions, telling his story of his life, and there's said that on the Brehon laws, that Patrick even codified them. So they had the laws, but Patrick was then able to put them down. So there was an ability to write and to transcribe what they needed.
That's right. And, Irish poetry also developed later on. It existed then, but it also developed later on in the Pay schools in Ireland, as well as in the Bardic schools. And they're going to find there's some very unique terms used there that are really just Irish terms, even though you'll find it in the English language. And that tells us that there's a tradition in that goes way back before the English language anyway. And one last note on the times before Patrick, there was a 4th century Christian philosopher, Ethicus of Istria, and he's well known in ancient literature, and he wrote a cosmography of the world, and it said that he hastened to Ireland and remained there some time examining volumes. And he noted that the Irish were uncultivated teachers, but teachers nonetheless. And of course, this was before St. Patrick, and since he stayed and he examined volumes, you think that assumes that there's the existence of books in Ireland in the 300s. Now let's move on past that. I also read there where it says, the town of Armagh, we've seen in our other classes how important Armagh was as a center for Ireland and Ecclesiastical, and Brian Boru was laid to rest there, and he paid tribute when he was on his rise to the kingship of Ireland. That's right about Armagh, isn't it, Peter?
Oh, absolutely. And Armagh is, in older days, they referred to Tara, not Tara, but as in Cashel as the ecclesiastical capital. But Armagh is the ecclesiastical capital. And it's the only city in the world that has 2 cathedrals, one Roman Catholic, one Church of England, by the name of the Cathedral of St. Patrick. And they stand on 2 hills. And I've stood on the steps of St. Patrick's Catholic Cathedral in Armagh, and you look across, and there's the tower of the other cathedral. And it's in the Anglican Cathedral that Brian Boru's buried in the yards there. And it is that cathedral that is the ancient cathedral, the place, because it was the Catholic Church originally, where the new one was built in the 1800s, and the Catholics could build churches again. But the old one, the Anglican Church, is the church that the land and the place where Patrick declared to his cathedral to be.
Well, the reason I brought...
I'm sorry, just a cathedral, cathedra, it means chair.
Is that in the Latin?
In Latin. And it means chair. And of course, so if you go into a cathedral and there's a big chair where the bishop sits, and in the old thing of when it would be with the Pope, when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, which means he speaks from the chair, and the chair, of course, belongs to Peter. And so that's the symbol of authority. So a cathedral is really the house of the chair, and the chair is the bishop, who is the head of the diocese, or it's also referred to as the see. We have in Rome is known as the Holy See as a country, the Holy See, Vatican City, the Holy See. Well, each diocese is a see, S-E-E, and the cathedral is the house of the chair, the cathedral.
And that is what Armagh was to Ireland.
It was the seat of the bishop, and Patrick was the founding bishop.
Well, now, the reason I brought that up was that Armagh, there was a section of that town called the Saxons' Third, and that was due to the population that inhabited it, and that's according to Joyce in his Social History of Ancient Ireland. So they would have brought what education they had into Ireland. They weren't just... Although I wouldn't think that they would be sprinkled throughout Ireland, in the most important cities, you're going to find people from the continent and from Britain bringing some learning to the country as well as their own native learning. And they also noted that there was a yellow plague in the year 664, and that was in Ireland, and it killed many English that were in Ireland at that time. And that was as it was given in the reports of the day. Now we'll move to the Bardic schools themselves. What do we know about them? How did they teach? And, really, how did it form up? They lasted all the way down to, well, it was the time of Cromwell. And, Peter, we talked about, in a separate class, a separate lesson, we talked about Cromwell in the 17th century and what happened there. Well, if we take a look at those old Bardic schools, it started before Patrick, and most of what we know about them, of course, comes after Patrick, so we have to do a little deep thinking to figure out just what they were. But Joyce gives 7 lay degrees of wisdom for the ancient Bardic schools, and, it might have been sort of like our high school and college, or maybe the elementary school, because it took about 12 years to complete. And that's not too far off some of our educational timelines. But they say that the education in these original Bardic schools was very insular, meaning that what was taught there was all about Ireland. It was Irish poetry, Irish history, Irish custom, Irish laws, and they didn't reach out to the world much, at least until St. Patrick came. And if you take a look there, you can see that years are given, and they're taken from the Book of Ballymote, and they say no Latin was taught. Latin was not taught until Patrick and the church came to Ireland, and then it became very popular in a lot of the head schools way down in the coming centuries, but that's ahead of our schedule right now. And like we said, sometimes the alphabet was engraved on those large pillar stones, and they survive to this day. Now, I might also make a note, Peter, have you ever heard of the term, he was a man of the 50s, or he knew his 50s?
Sure, about the person who would speak, had to remember so many verses in poems, and knowing 50 verses, and you learned some at one point, and then you had to learn 50, then you're a man of the 50s, but you could also learn one section, another section, and as you matured, you learned more and memorized. That's part of that great oral tradition.
That's right.
And when the poorer people who didn't know how to read or write, but they heard the stories and they repeated the stories. And of course, we all know how the Irish, the old thing, if you can't remember how the story is, make it up. You just add on. But the oral tradition is how so much of this comes to us. And men of the 50s were people who would be asked to recite something for us. And that's still something that's very, very prevalent in Ireland today, the recitation of something. And they all know how to do it. I was in Letterkenny, and we had gone into a local pub to have a pint, and there was only the bartender. She was a lady about 70, and her grandfather had started this pub in 1807. And so we listened to her, and she told the stories, and then I excused myself for a moment, and I went to the back room and noticed that there was a piano there. So I played a little bit on the piano, and she said, "Oh, go back and play." And a friend of mine who was with me said, "Why don't you have him sing?" So I sang. And we were very endeared. We spent a couple of hours there just visiting with her. Then we went back to the hotel and brought some of the rest of our group with us. And she came down, and the bar at this time was filled with young men. And she said, "Now, quiet, everybody be quiet." And the young men all stopped their talking, and they turned around to listen to her. And she said, "He's going to sing for you." Didn't advise me to this before. She just said, "He's going to sing a song." So I sang a song, and then she said, "Now, boys, it's yours now." And one of the young men turned to me and said, "Sir, might we return the favor?" And every single one of those young men recited something that they had memorized through tradition. And that's entertainment. That's the you don't have television, they do today, but you didn't have television, you didn't have those things. So they entertained with what they could do, what they knew. And it was one of the most wonderful evenings because they were using this. They were like the men of the 50 who were able to recite from memory what they had taught and what they then pass on to others.
That's right. I saw the same thing. Even in the B&Bs in Ireland, some of the kids would come out to entertain, and they would have a recitation or a story or perhaps a piece on the piano, which
That's right.
Could have been a bardic thing too. And of course, the word bard has come to mean several different categories that were really separate. Now, a bard might have been somebody who was he told stories and he might have done certain things, but he wasn't the historian. He wasn't the keeper of knowledge. He was on a lower level than the file or the phila.
And also poets. And there's a great song, the Bard of Armagh. And you talk about the city of Armagh.
Yeah.
The Bard of Armagh. And so it's talking about the person who was able to entertain and to always, whether it be with the fiddle, whether it be with a story, whether it be with a song, they were able to pass something on to the rest.
And the lowest level of attainment in those bardic schools, according to Joyce's work there, was that a person had to learn 3 sets of 50 stanzas, and that's 50 stanzas of 4 lines each, and you had to learn 3 of them. So you had to exercise your mind quite a bit, and they did deserve a level of respect for that, that's for sure. Now, if we take a look at the living conditions that they think they might have had back then, Joyce tells us that in the olden times, a few students resided in the school itself, and those became really like literary stepchildren of the teacher, sort of a fosterage program. And the student was then liable for the care of his master in his old age, if it need be. So it was a two-way street. It wasn't just a one-way teaching and then you left forever. You owed a debt to that teacher, and it was part of culture and society. Most students lived in small huts that they built themselves near the school. And you can go back to the times of St. Columkill, looking at the old manuscripts, and it was said he walked in and he was talking, and he said, well, now, in what place shall I build my hut? Well, it's that type of thing. You just knew how to put a little lean-to together to serve your purposes, took the place of a hotel, and there you had your own little community. Everybody had their little hut, sort of like putting up a tent these days.
And you can find in some of the places in Ireland still, they'll have examples of these huts. If you go to Bunratty, there's a folk park, and in the back they have houses, and they'll give dates on them of this is how people might have lived, or they know they lived, be it throughout the 16, 17, and 1800s. Gave you an idea, and you can look into these damp, thatched roofs at times, because they used thatch an awful lot in Ireland in those times, as their roof, but there was a dirt floor, but they had a little fireplace built or a stove of some sort as time went on, and it gives you a hint of how they were living.
Well, and we also talk about how children that were taken into fosterage, what did they learn and how did they learn? Well, it said that there were laws, Brehon laws, I would imagine, that told how the children that were taken in under the fosterage custom, how they were to be trained. Like if as a child was to be a farmer, he wasn't to be trained to ride on a horse or do things like that. The girls were supposed to be trained in specific things. I imagine there was sewing, I think it was said, things like that, household duties. And if the foster parents, so to speak, did not teach the child correctly, they could be fined 2/3 of the fee that they collected under barterage or some sort of payment form. They could be fined for that, for breaking the law and really not educating the children as they should.
If you think about that system, fosterage, which we've spoken about before, even when we talked in Brian Baru, that he had fosterage and he sent children who were the children of Vikings, and he gave them to Irish families so that they would raise them and properly. But if you take the concept, which today it's not used the way it ought to be, but a godparent, a godfather or a godmother. And if something happens to the parents, it becomes your responsibility to make sure that the child is educated. And at baptisms, where godparents usually come in, you're asked the question, are you willing to take this task upon yourself? So that's tradition. It still exists. We don't do the same thing. A lot of times people don't even know who their godparents are, and they do it to honor your friend or something of that nature. But you take this fosterage way, and that you have an obligation. And
That's right.
It's a beautiful obligation when you think of it.
That's right. It's not just an honorary position.
That's
if
right,
something
yeah.
happens, you're due, or even if it doesn't happen, you're due to keep an eye on that child and add what you can to their salvation in one way or the other.
Absolutely.
Now, if we take a look, just before we leave the topic of the bards and move on to closer times in the monastic schools, if you take a look at the professions that ran in the families, the poetry, the history, the building schools, and law, The Ogham or Olaf was the highest degree that was attainable within that profession, and it usually applied to poetry or history when we see it written. And like I said, they had to know at least 350 stories in that one school just to get by, or 350 verses. I don't know which they were talking about. And they had to know the responsibilities of the king, like the king of Cashel. And if the king was misbehaving, that's how you knew it, because it wasn't just invented because you didn't like the king. You had the law that was recorded in the by the Seanachies, or the Bards, so to speak.
And you were becoming a part of a community. And to know what the king, in the proper way, a king is not just to be the one who rules. It's his obligation to take care of his people, to make sure that they're protected, to make sure that they're given an educational background, in a sense, that the fields are working. The king had a great responsibility, and so you had to know, and through the rules and the laws, you were taught to understand what everybody's responsibility was.
Well, and then since there was so much responsibility given to that Olaf, he was entitled to hospitality and respect from the leading families of Ireland, or at least his province, and he actually had a retinue which was entitled to follow him as he made his way through the country. Now, what we're told is that the highest degree, the top of the line, they could have an authorized delegation of 24 followers with them, and the lowest of the bards or the bardic schools could have 2. And that might be just a generalization to let us know who is the most important. Now, the poets continued to be paid or bartered with for services by the foreigners and by the Vikings that came in. As they settled and become a part of Irish life, they actually adopted these Irish customs and gave honor to the poets and these people that held the country together in a almost a spiritual way. And the O'Curry, the famous historian O'Curry, he also noted that the Anglo-Norman lords, they spoke, thought, and wrote in Irish at times. So you find the Geraldines, the Butlers, the Burkes, and the Keatings, they had their libraries of Irish language books back in the day, and it was really a pretty valued possession. And they also kept their wise men or bards like the native chiefs did. Peter, did you ever run into any of this?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's still going on in Ireland today when it comes to honoring the poet, a poet and the bard, they held equal rank with the king in terms of respect or of royalty. And in Ireland, a poet, an artist, pays no taxes. And they're trying, of course, to destroy things, unfortunately, but it just says within the culture, look at the great honor that is paid to those who have this particular talent, who, in fact, are passing down your culture and all of your background.
Well, that's exactly right. And, these old professional schools, they lasted till about 1641 in the coming of the penal days in Ireland. And they were really closed down in the 17th century when the great patrons of the schools, really the great families of Ireland, like the O'Neills up there in the north, all the great tribal leaders, they became homeless, or they were exiled, or they became part of the wild geese that had to leave the country, perhaps one day to return, but perhaps not. But they were the great people who pledged their monies, funds, and places to help the schools, and when they left, it destroyed the entire system. And that system was closer to a university-type system than the Hedge schools will end up being. But as these Bardic schools ended, the Hedge schools would start to begin, and we'll talk about that in our next segment. And some of those teachers and some of those students might have migrated to those first early Hedge schools as a way to keep the tradition of learning alive. I'm just sure of that. And of course, if we take a look at these Bardic schools, they started out as pagan and then became Christian. And of course, they were also introduced into Christianity from the Roman traders and folks that came over from Wales, and of course, Patrick himself. Now, the Bardic schools were secular. They taught in Irish, just as the Hedge schools did at first. They both taught in Irish. That was a point of pride. It was the only way you'd think of doing it. And the focus was on Irish language, Irish history, and the Brehon law. and they used intensive scientific study, according to Joyce, and there was a long succession of poets, Brehons, and historians in particular families. And the first English language account I found of that was from the year 1561, and they gave 4 levels of study there, and that would start off with the Brehon or the judge, the Seanachies or the pedigreer, and that would be the pedigreer, the guy who took family history and said, you're descended from him who is descended from him who fought at the Battle of Clontarf and won freedom for our country, things like that. So that goes way back before Patrick, too, according to all the writings. And then there was the Bard, which was a 3rd level, and then the highest level was the File, or the Fila, and he was the poet, the scholar, and he was the guardian of the values, much above a regular poet or a reciter of verses or a simple rhymer. What do you think about all this, Peter? Where are we going?
Well, where we're going is, of course, to the next section. But, you think about the person who is the one that brings you knowledge. The mind, as some philosophers say, it's a blank page, and that it needs to be filled up, and it's filled up with experience, and that experience is either the experience that I myself have, or those I learn from others who have had experiences and tell them to me, like the Seanachies telling the story. So I learn something. So the teacher, the bard, the one who carried with them the knowledge of who we are as a common people.
Well, I'll just say one more thing, and we'll wrap up our little Bardic presentation, and that was there's an interesting piece of information really that came down to us that everybody consults when they're studying the old Bardic schools, and that was from the year 1722, and they called it the Clan Ricard Memoirs from London, and that was 1722, like I said, and it was a school of poetry. It was like a Bardic school of poetry in the old tradition as far as we know, and it was for poets and descendants of poets. And most of them were already, even though they might have been young men, they were already notable in their tribes. They had shown their skill. And the school was located away from family and friends, so there were no distractions. It was a simple lifestyle. There was no windows. There was a table, a couch, a chair, and a little cubicle for each student. Now, when they started this school, the student would travel from his home to this place. And on day 1, the student was told to write a poem. And then he was led into his dark cubicle, no windows, no candles, and he was told to write a poem. One day later in the evening, candles were brought in to write by. The poems were then written out, supposedly in a rapid manner, and then taken outside to the professor for the professor to examine. So that was just day 1 of the school. These folks earned their living, I think, and they had to really want to do it. And the Clan Ricard memos also said that on Saturdays and on the eve of feast days, the students were often taken in by well-to-do families, and the school was actually open from Michaelmas to the 25th of March, and then went home with a report on them. And a memoir said it took 6 or 7 years to attain mastery. But I imagine a lot of that would have to do with your abilities. It would be shorter if you were better. And they were very exclusive schools. It was a very conservative form of education. Students came from traditional families and served traditional families in their particular expertise. And the study of Latin was really taken up early, at least after the time of St. Patrick. I guess you might say that, Peter, I was reading there Michaelmas. When was Michael? What was that about? Do you know what Michaelmas is?
It's the Feast of St. Michael.
And so that's the story as we've got it here on the Bardic Schools. And, you take a look at the writings of O'Curry, and he says that the 10th and 11th century classical knowledge is very good with these schools. And Quiggin said that the poets of the 13th, the 15th century, they knew religious literature in Latin very well. And some folks say to varying degrees that Latin was also used in the Irish medical schools at different levels. But the English tutors brought the decline in the Bardic schools, and the wars of Elizabeth and Henry VIII hurt the Irish and Anglo-Norman lords, and the flight of the earls at the beginning of the 17th century really brought an end to an age. And, next up we'll be talking about a little bit about the monastic age and how that led into the hedge schools. Peter, do you have anything to add?
No, I think we covered that pretty well. We were talking, you asked there about Michaelmas, and actually the Feast of St. Michael the Archangel, that's what it is September the 29th.
Ah, okay.
And and if you think about that, and you said from Michaelmas to March, well, that's like a semester.
That's right.
As we have our, why are our semesters actually the way they are in the old days? They were to make sure that school was done between planting and harvesting. So you have the agricultural mindset. But yeah, Michaelmas, which is the feast of St. Michael the Archangel.
Boy, oh boy. Well, I guess I'll just add, we're coming to the end of the Bardic School, and we see things like in 1563, the Earl of Desmond had to pledge that no bard would appear in his territory, as they were a threat to the powers that be. And that was issued from the highest levels, I'm sure. And like I said, by 1610, the entire country was becoming dominated. Although there were still a few educated families that survived, there is some mention in history of some antiquaries and deducers of pedigrees for noble families, but they're more or less isolated, and it's not really incorporated as a system within the country. So by the time the year 1700 hit, it was a very low point for native learning, and the Clan Ricard memoirs say that the schools were reduced just to reading and writing common dialect. That was as far as they could go. And he said that there was not one country school that was frequented by them since 1641. And the schools had declined into courts of simple poetry for reciting and talking. That about does it. We'll move into other things later, and we're coming to the end of the Bardic School section. And we've got our educational section here. We're going to talk about the monastic education, and then about the real focal point of what we were looking at, the hedge schools in Ireland that ran all the way up to the 19th century from the 17th century. Peter, do you have anything to add on the Seanachies or the Bards?
They'd tell the stories. And by the way, you couldn't criticize the rebels. You couldn't. It was very kind of interesting. They had their own little rules and things. But when they would all gather together, all the Seanachies would gather together, they would check out their stories. And so each one would tell the story. They would be given a story topic, so to speak. And each one would tell the story. And then they would correct each other, kind of like what we have to do sometimes. Oh, I'm not sure about that date. What about this date? We come to a conclusion. And they would listen to each one, then they would correct it and say, no, it's this and this. Then they would vote on it, and they would all vote to have the very same story, so that what you had was kind of this central control to make sure that the stories being told were uniform. And it's a wonderful thing. It's like finding mistakes in textbooks, which I have this terrible tendency to do. And I go, this is wrong. This isn't what someone says, what are you doing? I said, I'm correcting this textbook because I just happen to know that what they have printed here isn't right.
Yes.
Because a lot of times they're not really educated people. They're just printers.
That's exactly right.
And so the Seanachie, you said about how that custom is probably gone of going from place to place, but they still have the Seanachies. I've visited with a couple of them, and they tell the most wonderful stories that you forget about, and it's just they talk about the Tooth of Dunan, and they talk about the leprechauns, and they talk about the fairies, and they talk about the battles, and they give such meaning to it, and you almost feel like you were there, and you get all excited listening to them. And the old custom is they needed uniformity, they wanted it, but it was the carrying on of the tradition and making sure that the story didn't find itself having 10 different endings.
Well, and these the people today in modern times, there is no true school that you can go to learn these things. It has to be an act of inspiration where you'll learn from the people or you'll learn from the old written records. So it does take a special person to do it.
Oh, without a doubt. And, there's some of the things that were never written down and never told. And I remember meeting a man, and you couldn't understand him half the time because his English was so mixed with Irish, and his accent was very difficult. And in the County Kerry, I might add, where sometimes it seems to be a mumbling that comes to you. But he would tell stories when he was a runner in the War of Independence, and he was like 10, and they'd give him a message, and he was able to pass by the British soldiers and the black and tans and go, and he would tell us stories. And I met him in the County Kerry I met him in 15 years ago. He's gone now, and he was 90 when I met him.
Now, were any of his stories about the old days?
Oh, absolutely. He always told about what he did when he was a child. Then he was a blacksmith, and all his fingers were crooked because at the tops they went up to the second knuckle, and then they were bent from the hammer and the hard work. And he lived in the house by himself. His wife had died many years ago, and he just lived by himself and was known through the town. He would get up, but he'd sit and talk to him, and he got to know us because we kept visiting the same town over and over, and we got to know him, and he would be glad to sit there and tell you stories. We loved them. They were great.
Did he have a title, or did they just say,
no,
he's got great stories?
He's great story. He's the old, well, they referred to him as the mayor of Beaufort.
Oh, my.
Because he was the oldest citizen.
Boy, that's interesting. Boy, we're sure lucky to have you here comment on the modern times. So ends this chapter of Irish History from the Hedgerow. The entire series is available at www.irishroots.com. We have broadcast series on genealogy, song, local history, as well as original publications for every county in Ireland. The Hedge School in Ireland was totally reliant upon the local community to survive, just as we are here today in our modern-day Hedge School. If you believe in what we are doing for your community, please do send us your support. You can sponsor a session of Irish Hedgerow history for as little as $100 and become a recognized scholar of the hedge. You will also receive a pass or letter of introduction from the instructors here at the school, as was the custom of the hedgerow. So keep the hedge growing with your donation, subscription, or membership. Thank you. We have been available for speaking engagements, exhibits, tours, and educational events since 1984. You can reach us at the Irish Roots Cafe on Twitter and Facebook, and on our homepage at www.irishroots.com, by mail at our U.S. location, the Irish Roots Cafe, Box 7575, Kansas City, Missouri 64116. Leave a message on our phone recorder at 816-256-3360. Copyright 2009.